Special Education at the University of Connecticut. He is also co-director of the Center for Behavioral Education Research. He has expertise in beginning reading and early vocabulary instruction and intervention, school-based experimental research, multi-tiered or RTI systems of support, and effective practices for students with learning disabilities. Dr. Coyne has directed or co-directed 5 multi-year research projects funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences, focused on optimizing vocabulary and beginning reading practices for students with diverse learning needs through school-based experimental research. Dr. Coyne provides assistance and consultation to school districts and state departments of education around the country related to reading and literacy initiatives. He regularly presents at national conferences on research related to effective instructional practices, school improvement, MTSS, and beginning reading and vocabulary instruction and intervention. Dr. Coyne has held certification in both elementary and special education and is a former special educator in public schools. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Coyne. I'm excited to hear your presentation this evening.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sherry and Pam and Andra. So excited to be here and so pleased to have this opportunity to be here with you. Really also excited to have been to be part of this book, Structured Literacy Interventions. Is a really a wonderful opportunity, and it's a great book, and really so happy to talk with you all about this. I've been doing work with vocabulary research in schools for about 20 years now, and it really is one of my favorite things to talk with folks about. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with you. I am, let's see the next slide here. My co-author, Susan Loftus-Rattan, is not going to be able to be here, but she was an important contributor to this chapter. Yeah, so let's see. So one of the things that I'm not particularly good about being spontaneously funny during presentations. So one of the things that I do is I sort of build in the humor up front. So, but one of the things with being someone that works with young kids on vocabulary is there's no lack of good content to talk about when you're talking with kids about what words mean. So just to kind of get us started here, I want to share some particularly notable responses that we've received in our vocabulary projects over the years when we ask kids, pretty much kindergartners, what different words mean. So when we ask some kids, what does forward mean? It means this word has 4 words in it. It also means there's a company called Forward and it makes trucks. When we ask things like, what does estimate mean? It means, I'm guessing how much hair you have. And also, you estimate people's brain and teeth. So this is a really sort of complex estimation skill here. We also have, what does participate mean? It means when you show magic in the classroom. And also, participating your mother. And I don't know if this is true or not, but the story behind this one is that this was a little guy that after every word just said your mother after the definition or after the word. So what does slumber mean? It's a party in your pajamas. What does blustery mean? It means I got a bluster on my finger. What does separate mean? It's when you cut your hair, it means that you separate the hair pieces. This is a very advanced, complex definition here. What does consequence mean? One consequence of too much TV is you might get furry eyes, which is true. I've seen that happen before. And of course, a consequence of eating too much candy is he got crazy with sugar. What does blend mean? When you blend, it's like stretching, but you move around when you blend. And finally, if it's snowing and the cat's outside, then the cat would blend. So I mean, I share these because they're funny, but also it kind of gives you a sense of how kids are really kind of grappling with what words mean and really trying to kind of make sense of them. And you can see where some of the kids are going here. Some of them maybe can't quite see where they're going, but you can see how that sort of, how they're working towards trying to make these words their own. Well, that's it. No more humor for the rest of the time. It's all serious now. And the kind of pathetic thing is I've been sharing these slides for so many years now that I was realizing that that when I developed this, it must have been back when Comic Sans was like an extra cool font to use. And if ever Comic Sans was cool, it definitely was a long, long time ago. So what I'm hoping to be able to talk with you about today is kind of go through the chapter, and I'm going to pretty much follow the chapter mostly, but with a couple of diversions here and there, but basically the same content as I think will be here. I'm going to start by talking about the importance of vocabulary, talking about how vocabulary fits within a conceptual framework, particularly with a simple view of reading and thinking about teaching vocabulary through oral language. Spending most of the time talking about the importance of direct and extended explicit vocabulary instruction, and then finish up with some a little bit of conversation about other ways to promote vocabulary learning. And just before kind of moving on, when we're talking about vocabulary here, what I'm referring to is understanding what words mean. And it can be whether you're reading those words or whether you're hearing those words or using those words through oral language. So understanding the meaning of words. The other thing is hopefully much of this is going to be familiar to you. But one of the things that we say in vocabulary learning is that depth of knowledge comes from multiple exposures to content in different contexts and meaningful situations. So hopefully this will reinforce what you already know, and then maybe also help to provide some additional depth and breadth of some of this knowledge and discussion. So why do we talk about vocabulary? Why is vocabulary something that it's important to think about in schools? I mean, and again, this is pretty straightforward, that we know that vocabulary knowledge is essential to reading comprehension. In fact, vocabulary knowledge is probably the best predictor of reading comprehension that we have. And it's a strong predictor throughout ages. So in fact, even we know that vocabulary at the end of first grade is a significant predictor, not only of reading comprehension like in the early grades, but continues to predict reading comprehension even 10 years later. And even beyond just things like reading comprehension, we know that all of learning is language-based. So this idea that we want to develop kind of rich, broad and deep vocabulary knowledge and understanding of words and what words mean really has important implications for all of learning. It's all profoundly dependent on vocabulary knowledge. And we have a lot of sort of complex theory in reading that's kind of hard to unpack and pretty complicated. But the theory that, or one of the primary theories that talks about the relationship from vocabulary knowledge to comprehension is really pretty straightforward. I mean, people talk about it as an instrumentalist hypothesis, which is a kind of a highfalutin term, but you could sort of just as easily call it the sort of no-duh hypothesis, right? So like to comprehend text, students need to know what the individual words in that text mean. Right, so it can't get much more straightforward than that. So if we think about a sentence that you're either reading or that the students are hearing, a sentence like Sophia was ecstatic about the science assignment and she was eager to start her homework. I mean, we can think about that word ecstatic in that sentence, right? So you have to understand the meaning of that word to be able to comprehend that sentence, right? Vocabulary kind of carries the bulk of meaning, within sentences. And the more complex and sort of important and rare that vocabulary is, probably the bigger lift it's going to provide in carrying that kind of weight of comprehension, right? So if you thought that ecstatic could mean something like, like miserable or bored, it would dramatically change the meaning of that sentence. So knowing that it's static means not just like interested and happy about it, but really excited and motivated to do that, then that helps you understand that sentence. And so understanding the meaning of individual words helps you comprehend the sentences, or is required and necessary for kids to comprehend sentences that they're reading or listening to. Having an understanding of vocabulary, important vocabulary in text, also helps you learn and infer the meanings of other words in those sentences too. So when we think about this sentence, there's this word eager in here. So if you know what ecstatic means, then, and you don't know what eager is, it's going to help you understand and perhaps be able to kind of infer the meaning of eager, right? So if you know that ecstatic means really excited, eager you might think would be like, like you want to do it, like you're excited to do it, like you want to get going. Like she doesn't want to kind of put off her homework. She's eager to start her homework, right? So all of these, so this is just a really straightforward way to kind of think about the role of vocabulary and comprehension. And I think it's something that just makes sense to all of us that are doing work in schools and working with kids. And finally, I also think there's this kind of larger way that we need to think about vocabulary, which is that, Stephen Stahl said that our knowledge of words determines how we understand text, define ourselves for others, and define the way we see the world. So, it really is about how we communicate with people, how we interact with the world, how we express ourselves. It has huge implications for our own self-worth, self-actualization, self-agency. So we, to be able to kind of be an individual in the world, we need to have language and words to express ourselves and to talk about and comment and think about the world around us. So in a sense, it's incredibly important. So we know that vocabulary is important, but we also know that kids enter school with meaningful differences in vocabulary knowledge as a result of differences in experience and exposure to literacy and early language activities. And so here's some data from, many of you are probably familiar with the Hart and Risley study. And, there are some critiques of some of the details of that study, which I think are legitimate. But I do think the sort of the overall message of the study and many other studies is still really resonant. And that's thinking about the kind of differences in experiences and exposure with language and vocabulary in the early years. So we could think about kind of, different kids in different families and thinking about how much language and exposure they're receiving. And so as part of this study, they found that some kids in some families were hearing about 600 words per hour, while others were hearing up to over 2,000 words per hour on average. And that may not seem that much until you start to think about what that means over the course of a week, or over the course of a year, or over the course of multiple years before kids enter school. When you think about some kids hearing 13 million words, while other kids are hearing 45 million words. And again, when you think about that, much of vocabulary learning, again, comes from multiple exposure to vocabulary in different contexts and settings. You can see how that really can, have a profound and meaningful impact on students' ability to benefit from the kinds of instruction and support that kids receive in school. So I think one of the big messages from this is that many of us, I don't think people that are like on this call that are involved in this work, but kind of think that kids have come into school on a level playing field, kind of equally prepared and ready to learn. And this is really profoundly makes us think about that. There really are these meaningful differences in the amount of language and literacy and vocabulary knowledge that students have when they come into school that we have to think about addressing and thinking about supporting this when kids come into school. So we know that there's these meaningful differences at the beginning of school. And we also know that this vocabulary gap, or this opportunity gap, grows larger in the early grades. Kids that enter with limited vocabulary knowledge grow much more discrepant over time from their peers who have rich vocabulary knowledge. Kids are just amazing word learners, just through sort of naturalistic experiences and are just amassing incredible amounts of vocabulary. So you can think about in the early grades that some kids are learning about 2 words per day, just almost through, not through osmosis necessarily, but almost. And some other students are learning as many as 8 words a day. And these are not words that are getting taught. This is just natural language development. But that adds up to, some kids are learning 3,000 new words a year. Other kids are learning 750 words per year. And you think back to the instrumentalist hypothesis, you can see how this happens, right? Kids are leveraging vocabulary knowledge that they already have to be able to infer and develop additional vocabulary knowledge that's kind of having this kind of snowball effect. Sometimes we call it the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer while the poor get poorer. So there's this kind of mechanism that's working to support those kids that already have vocabulary knowledge compared to some students that have less vocabulary knowledge. So we know that kids come in with some kids come in with limited vocabulary knowledge, and that these differences grow larger in the early grades. And we also have some research that says that very little instructional time is devoted to vocabulary instruction in the primary grades. So I think the takeaway message from some of this that I've been sharing now is that that in schools we have to think about teaching vocabulary and supporting vocabulary development with a sense of urgency, because there's a lot of forces at work to help to exacerbate these sort of differences among vocabulary knowledge in students. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how we think about a conceptual framework for thinking about how to support vocabulary knowledge. And my work is mostly in primary grades, but all this is consistent with how we think about vocabulary instruction and development across schooling. So, we all know what the sort of 5, big ideas from the National Reading Panel are in reading, and we kind of talk about them all the time. And it feels like we always say them in the same order. We say phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension. It's sort of like the Fab Five, and we can just kind of rattle them off like that. And I think sometimes what happens is we kind of, unintentionally kind of think about this idea that the way it's supposed to work is that kids develop phonemic awareness in phonics, and then they become fluent readers. And then once they're fluent and accurate word readers, then we can switch and start working on things like vocabulary comprehension. And I think that's a really, I don't think that's the most helpful way to think about it. And so I want to kind of think, kind of move away from this idea that you have to go lockstep through these 5 big ideas in that sort of way. Because when you think about it, right, in this sort of depiction, in this kind of approach, we're not getting to things like vocabulary and comprehension until 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, or with kids who are experiencing reading difficulties, they're not going to be accurate fluent readers. That's going to be something they're going to be continuing to work on for a long time. So if we wait to support things like vocabulary and comprehension and content knowledge until kids are accurate fluent readers, then we're really missing an important opportunity and a kind of window of opportunity. So instead, I like to think about this in terms of, kind of multiple trajectories of instructional support, right? That we want to focus on building kids' code-based instruction and code-based knowledge, like phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency from the very beginning of schooling. But at the same time, we also want to be helping kids develop vocabulary knowledge, content knowledge, listening comprehension from the very beginning of schooling. And sometimes things, the goal is eventually these things kind of come together to support successful reading, but sometimes they have to be kind of thought about almost in sort of different strands. And this is consistent with a simple view of reading, which we talk a lot about these days, but this idea that there are sort of these 2 major buckets that go into successful reading, really having the ability to kind of read words and sentences, like crack the code, pull the symbols off the page. And basically what we do is when we read is we turn print back into language, and then we use the same processes that we use to understand oral language to understand the text that we've just decoded back into language, right? So by this, but according to the simple view, it means if we're teaching things like background knowledge or vocabulary and listening comprehension through oral language, that's going to directly impact reading comprehension because it's supporting kids' ability to understand what they read after they have decoded. So hopefully that makes sense. But I think one of the things about that is it really makes the case for the importance of focusing on supporting vocabulary development through oral language. And this is for kids of all age. And one of the things I want to kind of focus on as a theme throughout this presentation is that The idea here, and especially when we're talking about kind of structured literacy, is that the idea that these language activities need to be planful and intentional and thought through carefully, that it's not just going to happen on its own, that we have to really carefully plan for these kind of intentional oral language experiences. And a lot of the work that we've done we've done this through read-alouds, both sort of narrative read-alouds or expository or informational read-alouds. And sometimes I think read-alouds get a bad rap, that it's sort of something we do when we have extra time, maybe. But read-alouds are really powerful instructional opportunities. There's this one story I heard that a teacher's principal was coming in to observe, and the teacher said, that's great that you're coming in at that time. We're doing our read aloud then. And the principal said, oh, that's okay. I'll come back some other time when you're doing instruction. Right. So it's this kind of idea that like there is an opportunity to engage in really powerful instruction during a read aloud. And part of that is because of the types of language, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes when we talk about academic vocabulary. But the idea that the language and the vocabulary in books and texts is incredibly rich. And in fact, I really like this kind of statistic, which is that the rarity of words in children's books is greater than that of all of adult conversation except for courtroom testimony, right? And the vocabulary that is used in children's books are considerably rarer than those in speech on primetime adult television. So I always find this very humbling. Like, I think about, sitting around with friends at dinner, thinking that we're having some kind of sophisticated intellectual conversation. And in fact, we're probably using vocabulary that's about the same as you might see in like Curious George books or something like that. And so just to kind of give an example of that, here's a picture book called Imogene's Antlers. I don't know if this is a book that you've heard of before. There's no real reason why I picked this out. It's just a standard kind of read aloud, but I think I was able to kind of get a good picture of it or something. So, so just think about this sentence. Her brother Norman consulted the encyclopedia and then announced that Imogene had turned into a rare form of miniature elk. So when you think about even just that one sentence, think about the kind of the complexity and the richness of the vocabulary in that one sentence, right? And it kind of makes you think like, that this is really concentrated language and vocabulary. So the story here is that one day Imogene wakes up and she has suddenly sort of grown antlers for no reason, right? So her family and mother are trying to scramble around to come up with some solution for what to do with Imogene's antlers. So some of the other words that come up in Imogene's Antlers are words like antlers, difficult, prodded, glared, advice, offer, fainted, lovely, decked, several, decorate, wandered, milliner, arrived, assistant, sighed, eventful, and overjoyed. And so when we're being kind of honest with ourselves, how many of you use these words in your everyday conversations? I know that I've never used the word milliner in my life before. In fact, I don't even know what a milliner is until, this was a book that my daughter wanted to hear read aloud a million times. So now that I know a milliner is someone that makes hats. And so what happens is Imogene's mother tries to get a milliner in to make a hat that would cover her antlers, which is a big fail, but it's an interesting part of the book. So the idea here is that a lot of times this sort of oral language opportunities to develop vocabulary are not going to happen in just conversation sometimes, right? What's going to happen is that it needs to be intentional. So kids are not going to be exposed to the language and vocabulary that we want them to learn from watching TV or from talking with their friends, or even from probably talking with adults. It's going to happen when we really intentionally think about providing students with opportunities to interact in a really rich language environment. And that's kind of the sort of foundation of vocabulary teaching and vocabulary learning. So just a summary. So many school students begin school at risk for language and comprehension difficulties. Instruction intervention focused just on code-based skills is not going to be sufficient to meet those students' needs. And so instruction intervention and meaning-based skills like language and vocabulary and listening comprehension should really start at the beginning of schooling and should be an important focus of instruction intervention throughout. And a lot of times this instruction can be separate from code-based instruction, right, within oral language activities, and especially for students experiencing reading and decoding difficulties, because these are students are going to be limited by their reading abilities to the vocabulary and language they can access in the text that they read, but their ability to comprehend language and comprehend language and vocabulary is probably much more advanced than what they can actually read. So the mechanism and the vehicle for engaging in the vocabulary learning and language development is going to happen in oral language activities, not within the kinds of potentially simple decodable text that students are reading importantly, but are not going to include that kind of vocabulary. So what do we know about supporting vocabulary through instruction? And so there's multiple ways to kind of work on vocabulary and teach vocabulary. This chapter in this talk is really focused on direct and extended vocabulary instruction, teaching kids the meaning of individual words. And so this is a figure that comes right out of the chapter. And so some things that we know from research about kind of maximizing the effectiveness of direct and extended vocabulary instruction is focusing on teaching academic vocabulary, giving students clear and understandable definitions, introducing vocabulary in supportive and meaningful contexts, teaching using explicit instruction, providing extended and interactive instruction that promotes deep processing, giving students immediate feedback, and then incorporating review of taught vocabulary over time and in different meaningful contexts. So we're going to kind of go through, and I'm going to give you some examples of what each of these things looks like. One of the critiques of vocabulary instruction, especially direct and extended vocabulary instruction, is that it's impossible to teach the number of words that kids need to learn. And right, like we think about these kids that are learning 8 words a day, and that's like not just school days, that's like every day of the year, 365 days a year, right? So you can't possibly introduce and teach all those words through direct instruction. But although the number of vocabulary words that can be taught directly is limited, if we do a really good job choosing the right words to teach and teaching those well, it can make a significant and meaningful percentage of the words that some students will learn during their school year. And they'll really be able to leverage that key vocabulary that we teach to help them better comprehend and understand things that they're listening to and reading. And they're also going to sort of jumpstart and stimulate their learning of other vocabulary through when they're doing wide reading and engaging in oral language activities. So I think there's a really strong case to be made for the importance of direct vocabulary instruction as one component as an overall approach to teaching vocabulary. The other thing that I think is really important is we really have a strong knowledge base to rely on. And so extensive research provides really compelling evidence that this kind of direct vocabulary instruction is effective, and particularly for teaching the meanings of words that are targeted for instruction. And I'm going to share with you, if I have time, a little bit later, some of the results of our research studies. And we also know that research shows that this kind of vocabulary instruction improves students' comprehension, particularly the comprehension of text that includes the vocabulary that have been taught directly. So we're standing on a really strong research base that provides us support on how to teach this vocabulary, and also the effects of teaching vocabulary on word learning and comprehension. So we just sort of talked about this, I think, so let me keep going. So first we start off with, how do we determine what, if we can't teach every word, how do we figure out what words to teach? And there's a couple of ways, there's different ways to kind of think about this. Probably the most important is to think about teaching what we think about as academic vocabulary. And this is kind of the language of school, right? These are the words that come up in school and come up in books, but students are unlikely to encounter or use in their everyday conversations with friends and families. When we're talking with each other, we don't have to use a lot of complex vocabulary because we're engaged in a shared experience, right? So we're experiencing the same thing, and we can communicate with sort of more common language because we don't have to kind of refer to these things that are not part of our context. When we're in school and we're talking about kind of different ideas and we're reading texts, we're really focused on this kind of decontextualized language, right? Language and vocabulary is referring to things that are not in our kind of immediate interactions, but are part of the sort of the larger world or different kinds of thinking. So, you know, these are words like contrast, evidence, locate, definition, investigate, right? These are the words of school that we think about academic vocabulary. You know, we can also think about sort of teaching families of words together that sort of share like morphological features, that's like common roots, And so by learning, words in a word family, you kind of can understand a whole group of words if you have an understanding of kind of the base or the root of those words. We'll talk about tier 2 words in a second. It's also really important to think about what are those really important words for understanding the text or content that kids are engaging with. That's another way to think about it. And there's some more information about this in the chapter, so I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. There are some of these academic word lists and vocabulary lists that are available that really sort of kind of rank vocabulary in terms of how rare and complex, or kind of, at what grade level are kids learning these kind of words, so that these are kind of some good resources for thinking about that. One way that folks have been talking about it is Isabel Beck and Maddie McCowan have kind of talked about there's different tiers of words. We have too many tiers in education these days. So this is not like MTSS tiers, this is like vocabulary tiers. So tier 1 words are those kind of basic words that most everybody knows. And then tier 3 words are these words that are really uncommon and mostly show up in.
Mike, somehow, Dr. Coyne, somehow you became muted. I'm sorry. There you go.
Great, thanks for telling me, because I can just go on and on without realizing that I'm frozen or that I'm on mute, so thanks. So tier 2 words are these words that appear frequently in texts. Kids already often have a contextual understanding for those words and might appear across different content areas, right? So sometimes people talk about these as like Goldilocks words, not too hard, not too easy, just right. So that's the really complicated research-based definition of tier 2 words, which is not too hard, not too easy. And so just as a quick little kind of check, if we had the sentence, Jose avoided playing the ukulele, if you had to choose one word to teach out of this sentence, what would be the word that you would teach? Probably you would teach avoided, because that's a sort of word that probably comes up a lot, but kids might not know. Something like ukulele, you might be considered a tier 3 word. You might define ukulele quickly, like a little guitar, but you might spend more time talking about avoided because that's something that's going to come up more often. So an example 2, which of these 2 words would you teach? Isotope, coincidence, absurd, lathe. You probably pick coincidence and absurd, again, because they're sort of more common across areas where things like isotope and lathe might be more kind of rare words that would only come up in different contexts. Okay, we're going to do a couple little activities here to kind of think about what are the words that we might want to teach. So I don't know if you're familiar with James Marshall, but he's a great kids author. He actually lived in Storrs, Connecticut, where UConn is. So so I have a kind of fondness for him, and plus his stories are just delightful and just as fun for adults as they are for kids. So again, there's nothing particularly special about this. It's just a common example of like a read aloud. So I'm gonna read this aloud to you, and as I'm reading through, see if you could identify what we might think as academic vocabulary or potential tier 2 words that you might pull out to teach directly to students, okay? So one morning when George, okay, stuff is in my way. One morning when George looked out his window, he could scarcely believe his eyes. Martha was walking on a tightrope. So you have to imagine that, George and Martha are hippo friends. And so you have to kind of imagine in your minds, Martha, the hippo, walking on a tightrope. My stars, cried George. I could never do that. Why not, said Martha. It's tons of fun. But it's so high up, said George. Yes, said Martha. And it's such a long way down, said George. I see what you mean, said Martha. Suddenly, Martha felt uncomfortable. For some reason, she had lost all her confidence and she began to wobble. George realized his mistake. Now he had to do some fast talking. Of course, he said, anyone can see you love walking the tightrope. Oh, yes, said Martha. Certainly, said George. And if you love what you do, you'll be very good at it too. Martha's confidence was restored. Watch this, she said. And Martha did some fancy footwork on her tightrope. All right, so take a minute and either write it in chat to share with folks, or to think about some of the words that you might feel like could be candidates for pulling out of this and teaching to students directly.
So we see the common class and fears scarcely mean realized confidence, confidence restored,
Right.
realized
Yeah.
confidence.
Yeah. So
Coming up a lot.
yeah. So
talking.
yeah. So scarcely, uncomfortable, confidence, wobble, restored,
Uncomfortable.
realized, restored. All of those would be great words to pull out and teach directly. And so we might not all be able to agree on the sort of top 3 words to teach from this story, but we can probably all agree on that there are some words that would be better to spend time teaching than others. And that's kind of probably where we are in terms of like vocabulary instruction, which we can't ever say for sure that these are exact words that we should teach. But we definitely have guidance for what are the kinds of words that make most sense for teaching directly and through explicit instruction. Okay. So once we've identified the words that we're going to teach, then we need to provide clear and understandable definitions. And so, one of the things we know from dictionaries is that oftentimes the definitions in dictionaries are designed for adults and not for kids that are just learning words for the first time. So sturdy might be soundly constructed or constituted, and cottage might be a smallish frame dwelling. So if you're just learning sturdy and cottage, you're certainly not going to know what soundly constructed or constituted is, or that a cottage is a smallish frame dwelling. So we want to come up with student-friendly definitions that are sort of aligned with the age and the development of the students we're working with. So sturdy might be something like strong, cottage might be something like a little house, right? So, and we want to kind of define these words initially for students who are first learning these kind of simply, and then we expand over time. So at the beginning, cottage might be a little house, and over time we might kind of differentiate that from a shanty or a cabin, or a shack. But when we're first introducing it, we really want to think about student-friendly definitions that are appropriate for students in certain grade levels. Sometimes we can get guidance from learners' dictionaries. Sometimes these were initially developed for like adults that were learning English, but there's a lot of these different kind of learners dictionaries available online that are really helpful in kind of coming up with those less complicated, dictionary definitions for adults that want to know the nuances among words, and more for they're more useful for maybe students that are learning these words initially. Take a minute and see if you can come up with a student-friendly definition. Let's pick confidence and maybe restored, and pick a grade level: kindergarten, first grade, third grade. Think about students that you might know or work with. See if you can come up with some definitions, student-friendly definitions that would work for words like confidence or restored. So one of the things we realize when you do this is it's actually really hard to come up with definitions that are going to be meaningful to kids. Like a lot of times we want to use, the word itself. I always want to say sturdy. Sturdy means like sturdy, and so one of the lessons from this is that it's often really hard to come up with student-friendly definitions on the fly. And so it really is helpful to kind of think ahead of time and really be careful and thoughtful in coming up with definitions that are going to work with kids. So there's no one right answer, but something like confidence could be feeling like you can do it, or feeling good about yourself, right? Some kind of things like that when I'm thinking about kindergartners or first graders. Restored might be come back or came back. Definitions like that are things to kind of think about when we're working with this with kids. We also want to use definitions as well as context. When we just use definitions, like kids memorize the definitions, but they don't really kind of understand how that definition fits, or that word fits in multiple contexts, right? So that's when you get like, he had a confidence, or, I saw a confidence, right? Like you can maybe say the definition, but you don't understand how it's used in sentences. So one of the things that we do in our research, and that the research talks about, is using the definition within meaningful context. So sometimes just putting it back into the sentence that it was in, right? So in these bricks will make a fine, sturdy house, said the third little pig. Sturdy means strong. Now I'll say the sentence again with with the words that mean sturdy, these bricks will make a fine, strong house. So you can say, you know, in the picture, the little pig says that the bricks will make a sturdy or a strong house, right? So kind of putting it back in. So, so you can say, you know, suddenly Martha felt uncomfortable. Suddenly Martha felt that she couldn't do it. You know, suddenly Martha felt like that she wasn't feeling good about herself, or she had lost all her confidence. She had lost, you know, she had lost her feeling that she could do it. And so you could, in kind of putting it back in, Martha's confidence was restored. Martha's confidence came back. And so then also giving additional sentences that might kind of fit with that. So other things could be sturdy too. A big tree could be sturdy or strong. We hung the tire swing from the big sturdy tree so it would be safe for the kids to play on, for example. One of the things that we want to do is it's good to kind of give kids simple definitions and give examples of how those are used in different contexts, but we also want to give them an opportunity to really learn these words deeply and interact with words and kind of really get to that level of deep processing. So some of this has to do with this idea that there's both breadth of vocabulary knowledge, how many word meanings do you know, but also depth of word meaning, like how well do you know those words? And we can sort of think about a continuum, like you could have no knowledge of word, you could have general sense, you can have knowledge of word but not really able to recall it, or you can have real rich decontextualized knowledge of a word, its relationship to other words and its extension to like lots of other kind of, so knowing a word is not an all or nothing proposition. Like, here's another way to kind of think about it. Like you don't know the word, you don't even know if it's a real word or not, right? Or maybe you've seen or heard the word, but that's all. You can't really define it or know what it means. Maybe you know something about it, you can relate it to a situation, or you know it really well, you have like ownership of that word and you can explain it and use it. So just as a quick little activity, see where you would put yourself in these 4 different words, polysemy, voracious, virtuosity, and morphology. So think about what category you would put yourself in for each of these words. So again, this kind of makes you realize, you know, there are definitely words that we kind of have heard and seen before. We might sort of have a sense of what they mean, but we're probably not ready to like use it in a sentence or define it to someone. So like polysemy, right? This is a vocabulary term, which means talks about how words that can have multiple meanings. Voracious is like a, you know, just an unquenchable sort of appetite or desire to do something. Someone could be a voracious reader or voracious eater. Virtuosity is a made-up word. So, but you know, it has kind of some parts of it. I'm thinking that that's sort of what my own definition of that is, maybe being good at doing like Zoom meetings, I guess. But you know, because it has some parts of it that we might have seen before, we might say like, I haven't seen that word before, but we might not know, right? So that's the trick one. And morphology is you know, the kind of study or the thinking about different words, part roots and prefixes and suffixes, things like that. So we want to get kids to that level where they don't just have a general sense of the word, but they really have deep knowledge and they can think about it and use it in different ways, understand multiple meanings, really be able to use it in their speaking and their writing. I just like to talk a little bit about the work by Isabel Beck and Bobby McCohen, who have done some really great work on this kind of rich, robust vocabulary instruction. These are for book groups and that kind of thing. These are really great books to kind of use, and they're research-based too. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. There's a lot more examples in the chapter about what are the kind of activities that help kids sort of develop this sort of deep knowledge of words. So we might give examples and non-examples. If this is sturdy, say that's sturdy. If you think it's not very strong, say, oh, that's not very sturdy, right? A big jet airplane in the sky, a little paper airplane on a windy day, a tower made of cards, a big, huge rock. So the goal is to get kids really thinking about these words. And, that sturdy doesn't just mean big, right? Because, a tall tower made of cards isn't sturdy. And then getting kids to kind of, the purpose of all these activities too is to get kids to kind of elaborate on things and to kind of engage and scaffold extended language use, right? So getting kids talking about words and talking about things using these words is the goal of all of these things. This is another activity similar where we'll show pictures, and fleet means fast. So if you think picture shows something really fast, you can say that's fleet. If you don't think it's very fast, you can put your thumbs down and don't say anything at all. We have kids whisper because feedback from teachers was like, you don't want a whole classroom of kindergartners yelling out at the top of their voices, that's fleet. So we've learned over time, but these kids in this picture look fleet. The fleet boys ran out of the water. The turtle is slow, so not fleet. The jaguar, the cheetah is really fast or fleet. The jet planes are fast and fleet. The baby is not fast or fleet. But this was a picture that after a while, once we started looking at it, we sort of realized, like, look at this little kid, like she has like little knee pads on or something. So maybe this, and this is great. Like if kids will say, wait a minute, I think the baby is fleet because look, those knee pads, I bet she's just moving across the floor. That's awesome, right? Like getting kids like actually talk about these and kind of justify what they're saying. That's what we want from these kind of activities. We also kind of scaffold things where have kids use words in sentences. We sort of have these prompts where if they say a sentence without the word, we sort of prompt them to say it with the word or to expand on it, or we have kids like repeat sentences. So we add a lot of scaffolding too. This is an activity where you get kids to talk about their own experiences. Here's an example from this book where it was really wet and drenched. We asked kids to tell us a time when they were drenched from the rain. More questions. Also, a lot of times the way we organize words in memory is by reinforcing connections between these words and other words. So using graphic organizers is a really helpful way to do that. So we might say, timid is a word that talks about how we feel. What are other words that talk about how we feel? Or we might say, timid means that we're sort of shy and scared about something or nervous. What are times when you might feel timid, right? So there's ways to kind of connect concepts together, connect words with other words. There's just sort of ways to we have this word serpent and we kind of break it out. What is it? What does it look like? What are some examples? These are just a whole lot of different words that, kind of have to do with weather, and we just make these connections between the different words. So there's to kind of organize these things visually that helps them to kind of cement these pathways in memory that we want them to develop is a really helpful way to do that. So that's a really quick version of some of these activities that get kids to interact with words in sort of meaningful, interactive ways and making them their own. One of the things that's really hard is then reviewing vocabulary. And so again, the idea is that kids are not going to learn these words unless they hear them lots of times and in lots of different contexts, and it kind of intentionally words get reviewed over and over again. And this is hard to do. So different ways that we've seen teachers do this before is, having word walls. Sometimes what we do is we put the kind of target pictures on the wall for kids that might not be great readers. So they don't have to just look at the words. They know that this picture represents fleet or this picture represents enormous. And so, teachers can refer students to these pictures of this word wall to say, like, can you do that, say that again, or use these words to do that. Sometimes we keep like checks next to those pictures or words. Every time a student uses one of those words, they get a check. And so people are trying to kind of get more checks and keep track as a class how many times people use those words. Sometimes people sort of give homework assignments like, come in and let us know like when you heard this word at home. And one of the interesting studies that found that like oftentimes kids would make those up. Like they would come into school and make up an experience that they heard that word at home, but that didn't matter. Actually, that was just as meaningful as if they had actually had an experience, because the sort of effort to come up with an opportunity or experience of seeing or encountering that word at home was equally beneficial, right? So it's this idea of really getting kids to think about words and use words and understand words in different contexts. So the kind of summary of this, and I'll wrap up in about 5 minutes, is we want to teach important words, directly and explicitly. We want to choose academic vocabulary from books that you are reading aloud and text students are reading independently, or that are related to the content of instruction. We want to choose words that will enhance the meaning of text or content are important for students to know. Teach words directly by providing clear and understandable definitions. Model word meanings by using both definitions and context. provide students with the opportunity to process words deeply through these engaging interactive activities that encourage extended language use and discuss words multiple times within and across lessons. So that's the kind of summary of what direct, extended, explicit vocabulary instruction looks like and how we can maximize the effectiveness of that. I just want to, at the end, touch a little bit on other ways to promote vocabulary learning. So we know that we can't teach all words directly. So we want to also think about approaches that may have more generative, indirect effects on vocabulary learning. And these can be things like, there's other chapters in the text that talk about this, really just focusing on general language development, focusing on things like morphological, syntactic, or metalinguistic awareness. Also just kind of thinking about nurturing an appreciation and consciousness of words and their use. And another thing that we've done in our research a little bit is increasing the intensity of support for some students through thinking about vocabulary for multi-tiered system support, right? Increasing the time and the opportunity through small group learning for those kids that we know are most at risk for potentially not benefiting equally from classroom instruction. So I'm going to end with just a couple of slides on word consciousness, because I really think it kind of gets at this idea of what we want to kind of get to. So here's an example of some students that have word consciousness, right? So Ms. K is a teacher and she says, "Good afternoon." And Darlene says, "Salutations, Ms. K." Melissa says, "Greetings." Daniel says, "Hello." Ms. K says, "So how was recess?" Beth says, "Invigorating." Thomas says, "Exhausting. We played football. Delightful. There is a lovely breeze." Or abbreviated, "It was too short for me." So you can tell that Miss K has done something to get these kids excited about vocabulary and words. I mean, because we communicate with each other all the time, we just don't think about the words that we use or the vocabulary that we use. So the goal is that vocabulary learning doesn't just have to happen during the sort of 10 minutes of vocabulary instruction that's scheduled throughout the day. Anytime that language is happening, it's an opportunity to engage in vocabulary instruction. Here are these kids that are basically like, competing with each other to use the most interesting and, complex way to describe their time at recess. And so breaking out of the bounds of like this kind of, rote vocabulary learning that we think about maybe from our own experiences is going to sort of open up this world for vocabulary learning throughout the day, and really get kids excited about and think about the power of language and words. And we want to include those kind of components during the day where we're doing this kind of structured, explicit vocabulary instruction. But we also want to model our own appreciation and use of vocabulary and support students in kind of thinking about the power of language and words. So I'm gonna skip way ahead now and end. There's some research results too, but I'm not gonna share those. You can, how do I get through here? Let's see. I'm gonna go fast. All those great slides. I'm gonna end with the last one, which is, what does greater than mean? So we were thinking like, someone would say like 3 is greater than 2. But this little kid said, "It means that I can do more gooder stuff. You can draw a picture that doesn't have dinosaur teeth. I can draw a picture that does have teeth. Mine is greater." Thank you so much. It's great to get a chance to talk with you, and sorry if I was a little rushed at the end, but I know at least we have a couple of minutes for questions. So I'm happy to answer some questions or engage in a conversation. And also, I think there's a possibility for folks to send me some questions if we don't get to them. And I'm happy to kind of get back to the PaTTAN folks about that too. So I don't know if
Andrew's gonna close us up.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew.
There is a question about vocabulary assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Any suggestions for assessment?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and a kind of gap in in our tool chest a little bit. I think there's sort of general vocabulary assessments that get at overall vocabulary. Things that we're familiar with, like subtests on achievement tests or the Peabody picture vocabulary test. We've used assessments in our research studies for individual words that try to get at different levels of word knowledge. So sometimes we might have just be able to kind of pick out a definition from a list of, so we have more receptive, like point to the picture, right, that goes along with this word, or does this word mean this, yes or no.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. But we've also kind of done more expressive measures where we've asked kids to kind of define words, or even just sort of, be able to kind of use words in some, some stories, or just kind of, talk about this picture, using some of the words, or sort of start with a sentence starter that includes the words and see if kids can finish that off. So they tend to be more like curriculum based or curriculum assessment measures that sort of get at individual words. So it's a great question, and I wish we had better answers for more, but because vocabulary is so individual word by word, that it's trying to kind of come up with ways to see if kids understand the words that we're teaching.
And just one more question that I'm going to pick out, and then we'll send the others to you that you can, share answers for. Do you recommend the same procedures and principles for teaching vocabulary in a remediation capacity as you would for core instruction?
Yeah, so I think, one of the big ideas in vocabulary instruction is this sort of like dosage or amount of time or opportunities that kids have to interact with words. So a lot of times in like an intervention setting, what we do is, reinforce and reteach and give additional opportunities to work on words that are also being taught in the general classroom. So, if the word is, confidence, and that's something that's being kind of addressed in the classroom, in a small group intervention setting, we might talk about the same word, but we'll give it extended additional opportunities with more scaffolding to talk about those words. So there's a couple of different ways to think about it. One is to kind of build vocabulary that we assume that students already have, that are sort of foundational vocabulary. The other idea is to kind of give additional extended opportunities to focus on grade level vocabulary that's being introduced in the classroom. And again, the big piece here is that not assuming that kids are going to be able to learn and work with these vocabulary in text that they're reading. So really pull it out into the oral language activities if the vocabulary instruction in the classroom is happening more within text and within in things that kids are reading. And we found, I'll show this really quick, we found in our research studies that when we give kids additional supplemental vocabulary intervention that supplements the classroom instruction, we find that there's a huge boost for kids in terms of their word learning that helps kids sort of experience similar learning to non-at-risk kids that only receive tier 1 instruction, right? So tier 2 instruction boosts the vocabulary of at-risk students to the level of vocabulary learning that not at-risk students get with only tier 1 instruction. And again, this is sort of the words that we're teaching, not necessarily, kind of broader comprehension or vocabulary knowledge, but supplemental vocabulary intervention that builds on to tier 1 classroom instruction is a really powerful way to increase intensity, increase dosage, extend the opportunities for kids to interact with words in small groups in a very supportive, interactive environment.
Thank you so much. I know we've run out of time. I did post the exit code and that information in the chat, but I just want to thank you, Dr. Coyne, and thank everyone for joining us for this evening's book study session. We are grateful to you for deepening our knowledge of Chapter 6, Structured Literacy Interventions for Vocabulary. The recording for this presentation will be added to the PaTTAN Literacy Resource Hub, and it can be found at the link that we'll post in the chat again, as well as on the PaTTAN YouTube channel. For those of you who are seeking Act 48, please click on that form link in the chat and the exit code for this session. It's been placed in the chat. And just again, the exit code is YOKL. And you must complete this form by midnight to receive Act 48 credit. We suggest, if possible, you do it right now. So it's out of your mind and you've got that done. Please remember that the Zoom link and passcode will remain the same for every session that we have. And the Zoom link and passcode was sent to you in the email from PaTTAN.